All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to this month's Beyond Compliance webinar and podcast series. We're really excited to have you all back. Got another really great topic that's been in high demand and kind of ties right into the concept of the whole Beyond Compliance concept. We're going to get past compliance today and talk about operational effectiveness, and specifically uncovering those hidden dollars in your food facility. And we're really lucky we've been working on trying to get Daniel Campos from the London Consulting Group and working to get them in here and have finally gotten schedules to coordinate. And we're really thankful to have them. A lot of really great content. So I think you're going to really enjoy what we've got to share today. So more on that in just a second. But for those of you that may be new, we see a lot of new faces registering this month because we're getting into a topic that we've been looking forward to here. The Beyond Compliance series really is meant to be an educational session designed to share ideas and concepts, best practices, strategies that the best companies and practitioners and consultants are using out in the field. So this isn't really meant to be a lot of high-level concepts. It's not meant just to be talking about law changes. It's really meant to give you tactical ideas that you can take back and use in your own facility. And so we really do our best to find topics that are important to you and that will make an impact. And we encourage you to share what you want to hear more about, even if it's specific presenters even. We'll do our best to get them in here. And as I mentioned, getting more to the operations side of the house is something we've been really looking forward to. And so we're excited to share that today. But we welcome all of you, and we do these each and every month. And we'll continue to do that. And obviously, we put them on free as charge, and it's something that we're very honored and pleased to be able to bring to our community. So you'll hear a lot from these amazing experts like Daniel today on the strategy and the approach and the consulting and testing side of things. And we're on the technology side. So you'll hear a lot of really amazing things through the course of these series. And what we do is help you implement those ideas better, faster, smarter with our cloud-based food quality management systems. So we have solutions for food safety, quality assurance, which we'll be talking more about today in some capacity, and obviously supplier compliance is always part of that. And we're doing some really exciting things, and we'd love to hear what you're up to and how we might be able to serve you. So encourage you to check out our website, safetychain.com, and we'd love to have a conversation after the webinar to see if there's some ways that we can help implement what you learned here today. A few housekeeping items just to get through. If it's the first time you've joined us, one of the things we share with our presenters when we're talking about putting this together, because a lot of time and effort goes into these, and it's why we're so grateful to have them make some time in their schedule to do this. And we talk about them being informal but professional. And so what I mean by that is we try and set the tone that if we were all hanging out at a trade show, what would we be talking about, and how would that conversation go? And we want it to be informal in the sense that we want you to engage. This is really for you, so we want to encourage you to ask questions. There's a question panel that you can pop open and fire those off. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, but Daniel has asked that if a question comes up that I can rudely intervene. So I'm going to do my best to sneak in at the right spots and get your questions in. So feel free to send those over. I'll be monitoring those, and I'll pop those in as I can, as politely as possible in between different slides here and there. So encourage you to engage with us, but also we'll hang tight at the end for anything we weren't able to get to. Also notice when you send in your questions, there's nobody else listed on the panel there other than the panelists ourselves. So it just comes straight into us. And one question I'll get out of the way up front that is usually the most common is, will we be sharing the recording? The answer is yes. And also Daniel and his team over at London Consulting Group are kind enough to give us permission to use the deck as well as a follow-up piece. So if you prefer to sit back, grab a cup of coffee and just listen, you can do that. If you want to take some notes, feel free to do that as well. But we'll share both those assets, within a couple, 2-3 days after the webinar, so you can reference them later or share with some colleagues. And last but not least, we are a webinar service, and we all do these meetings every day, and sometimes things go a little wonky. So rest assured, we are recording. We'll be okay. But if you're having any audio issues, one option is that you can use either your phone or your computer audio. So sometimes the quick switch is the easiest way. There's a little audio bar that you can select and just pop over to the other option. We also have Janae on our team stand by in the background. So if you have any technical issues, send those via the chat box and we will do our best to help you out. So with that, we're going to get into the good stuff, the reason you're here. And I keep saying we're excited about this topic, and the reason is that it comes up so much with our customers. So compliance is obviously a big part of what we all do. But really that next level, what we call beyond compliance, is about this operational effectiveness, and the impact that it makes in this industry specifically is so powerful. And the London Consulting Group, they're our go-to guys. Right? They are the folks that we look to for expertise in this area, and why we're so excited to have them join us today. So I'll tell you a little bit about Daniel. He is the managing partner at London Consulting Group. They're a multinational operations consulting company in over 22 countries. He has over 15 years of experience serving Fortune 500 and family-owned clients in the U.S., Mexico, and the Americas. And they've been in industries as diverse as food manufacturing, healthcare, insurance, and medical devices. He received a BSc in industrial engineering in his native Mexico. And Daniel enjoys family life in Irvine with his wife, Lucy, and their two daughters, where they like to travel and camp out under the stars. Daniel, you're my kind of guy. This is our kind of topic. We're excited to have you. Welcome. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Brian. And good morning, everyone, or good afternoon on the East Coast. Thank you for making the time to hear about this very interesting topic. It's interesting to us. We're passionate about it. It's what we do. And I'll skip these few slides that speak about our 25 years experience and a couple of our customers in the U.S. Where we focus specifically on food processing. So you'll notice a few name brand items or brands here, perhaps $30 to $500 million companies, down to the $2 to $3 million companies. So wherever you are in this spectrum, I'm hoping that this topic will be interesting and relevant to your day-to-day. What we're going to be talking about today pertains to all the activities in a business. This is beyond compliance. So certainly certifications is something that we worry about, but it's never disconnected from operations, from IT, from the challenges of companies that are merging with others, and certainly the strategy and the sales of the business, et cetera, et cetera. So what we'll learn today is all about that. And I'll start by giving you this insight. Why do companies hire a consulting company? Why do companies use consultants? If you read what's out there in the media, you'll see that consulting companies sell themselves as the holders of the truth. Right? They have a magic ball and they can tell you what's going to happen. Or, if you listen to the other side of the story, they ask for your watch and then tell you the time, right? And in our experience, that's not what we do. We are hired because companies need extra hands, because they don't have enough time to run the business and improve it, because they need a new perspective. We do this year round. We have hundreds of projects every year. And this gives us a perspective that's unique, certainly relevant to our customers. And very importantly, we bring new tools. And so my hope today is that some of the tools that I'm going to describe to you, you can take and apply to your daily work. Okay, and I'm going to kind of open the curtain and share what we do, how we do it, specifically to help companies work better, right? And so that is precisely what in store today for you, the topics. The performance assessment and its importance, building a roadmap, the methodology that we use, some of the solutions and best practices around this, okay? And we'll take it one step at a time. All right, so the first thing is, how do we do a performance assessment? And more importantly, what is a performance improvement assessment? Number one, it's a diagnostic process. We are looking to discover, to quantify, and very importantly, not to design solutions. That comes later, and there'll be times for that. There always is. This is a very important differentiation because you don't want to come into these discovery processes as with an idea in mind. This is why things happen, or this is the root cause. What you want to do is come at it with an open mind, because you do get a lot of surprises. At the end of the assessment, what you want to have is a nice, specific, implementable goal that is very narrow and that is quantifiable in its opportunities. This has a lot of legs. We'll talk about this at length. But here, what you want to do is make sure that you're not shooting for the stars. You want to fix a number of things or discover a number of conditions based on symptoms as a condition to a successful project later on, okay? And I'll touch about it here. It's fairly obvious, but a very successful assessment requires, first of all, top management involvement. And then, as you see here, a clearly defined scope. And we'll talk about all these topics separately. Very specific strategic perspective, a change management process that's built in, and, very swift execution with well-trained team members. Okay, so let's talk about this first in terms of scope. This is something that is potentially very familiar to you guys. Just compliance. It's a very high-level compliance map based on the GFSI standard. What you'll see here is your hazard plan at top, and then the supporting prerequisites with surveillance effort, taking products from suppliers, converting them, transforming them somehow into something that customers want, right? We have started assessments based on compliance processes. And so what this sort of idea gives you is perhaps you want to focus on some of the prerequisites. You may want to say, well, you know what, we're having issues with maintenance, and that's impacting our ability to comply. Or we're having issues with the quality of our materials because we have a lot of rejects, or the quality of our outputs and we have a lot of complaints from customers, right? Or we have non-conformances from forms that are not being completed on the floor, so maybe that points to opportunities on your production line. This helps because it's something that if you're in the trenches, you can understand it. And what we want to do is start with this and suggest that you switch to something a bit broader, which is using your business cycle as a guideline. And this kind of it's more like a zoom out of your activities. It still starts with suppliers, it ends with customers. But this allows you to set a scope that includes some of the other moving parts that are relevant to compliance, but that also drive other things like finance or company culture or just the distribution of fixed costs or other supporting structures, right? So what you'll see here is instead of talking about processes or we don't put it in terms of prerequisites, but they're here. What we do is we talk in terms of end-to-end processes. And so maybe there's a commercial and planning step in the middle that starts with forecasting, and it ends once the product is there, perhaps, or once it's made. And then operations specifically, where you've got, orders, and then, the receiving of the materials all the way through production and collection, right? And what we're trying to do here is pick a scope that is relevant to everyone, and very importantly, that's relevant to the strategy of the company, right? So picking a scope is very important. Step number one. Step number two is thinking about strategy. And this kind of takes you into a conversation that is important when you're planning out these assessments. Your area of responsibility may be a department or a set of departments, but nobody lives in a silo. Right? Everything you do in your function in a food processing facility certainly is tied to every other department, and certainly it's tied to the strategy of the business. So what you see here is a way to tie things together, starting with strategy. You'll notice here strategy is at the top left, and we start adding questions as we interview folks in the organization to provide some scope for the assessment. So we say, well, where's the company going? Where do we want to be in the next 5 years? Well, or where should we be that we're not? We're in the process of getting there. And then you can say, well, what processes are key to this strategy? So, for example, if somebody says, well, the company is entering new markets, we're starting to export. Okay, well, you would imagine that there's sales support, but there's also perhaps the supplier qualification process that is new to the company, right? So you start tying strategy to process, and you also now can start comparing process and strategy to structure, because if we do have all of a sudden 20 new suppliers for international venture, and we don't have the structure that has the experience or the time to manage these suppliers, then you're going to have a hard time following that strategy. Afterwards, what we want to do is say, well, are we measuring these processes and the function of the structure, and then are our compensation or incentive programs in line with the measurements attached to the structure? And at some point, you also want to question, do we have the right people in the right place? Do we need to enhance that through new hires or training or certifications, right? So it's a nice, easy way to look at strategy, but also, it's a way to guide the conversation. So as you narrow down the scope of your assessment, what you want to do is talk to the owners, talk to the decision makers, top leaderships, and focus on strategy and how it drives everything else. For example, one of our customers here is in California, is a dairy processor, and California is shifting into a federalized milk pricing scheme. So we can think about compliance today, or we can start with that strategy point in mind and then see what that does to everything else. The industry is completely changing in California. We can't think just narrowly on a line. Tariffs are changing for some or most of you somehow. So what do we need to do about that? Right? We're merging with another company. How do we support that integration? So the assessment would take a completely different flavor if we're talking about mergers, right? For example, something that a lot of our customers are doing, or they're starting to sell direct. Whether they were using a distributor somehow, or a broker, or they just want to go direct to their customers. And even some of them are selling directly to their customers through websites and other venues. How does that change our inventory very specifically? How does that change our order processing? So these conversations, along with some of the previous charts that I showed, are part of getting a scope for the assessment that works for your company, that's relevant. And it helps that you don't focus on something that is important, certainly, but it's not the key process to look at. A second element that I'll talk about now is about your timeline. This is something that surprises a lot of our customers when they hire us and we say, well, the first thing you want to do is an assessment, and it's not going to take 6 months or 3 months. It's going to take just 2, perhaps 3 weeks. And that process should be processed too in the middle of the screen. I apologize for that. So what you'll notice here is that we have a pre-assessment set of activities, communication about what's going to happen, training of the team, and setting expectations. Then very quickly, we jump into a very discrete, very fast, very aggressive, quote unquote, aggressive process, assessment process. And what you want to focus on is short sprints that work on a process at a time. And what we typically do is just talk about 2 or 3 processes. For instance, I was referring to end-to-end activities. So forecast to stock is a common way to see this, and order to cash, perhaps. Right? And you'll notice here that we're outlining a couple of weekly meetings, weekly progress meetings that occur perhaps at the end of week 1 or into week 2, at the end of week 2, the latest early week 3. And what we want to have is a final proposal or the analysis, the outcome of the analysis and recommendations by the end of week 3. So most of the analysis actually takes place the first 2 weeks. This, you can start to imagine that it requires a team that is out there. And I'll talk about what we're doing in just a sec. We're almost there. But, yes, it's a team. It's a group of people in your case. You assemble a team. And once you've gone through the strategy conversation, once you say, well, this is what we're going to look into, you have to be ready so that the assessment is short and sweet. We want everyone aligned for that assessment, looking for an immediate project start. This is one of the key elements, I would say, in getting an assessment that is relevant, that's significant, and that has a chance at making a difference. Now let's talk about what we do during the assessment. And this is where if you've got questions, these are the tools that we physically use. I've got a couple of pictures that are blurry on purpose, but I hope you get the idea of what we're doing here. And we'll talk about 3 of the main tools that you want to train for and be ready for if you're going to do something like this at your organization. And the first one and the most important one is the process map. Right? This is a large format document, and similar to what you would do to map your asset plan process, right? You want to go step by step and kind of maybe follow the product as it goes through the line, right, from the receiving of the ingredients all the way to the end, shipping, and then imagine what it does at the consumption point. So with that spirit, imagine what these conversations look like. We've got a scope that's strategic, right? And we do have a narrow set of activities that we're following. But instead of following a product, what we want to follow is a business document, a business process, an order, a forecast, a production job. And these documents, we use a specific structure, and we are kind of checklist. So, for example, we always start with an org chart, as it's mentioned there, because we want to understand who does the activities that we're going to be portraying. But the specifics are fairly flexible. What you want to do is find the largest piece of paper, and this I'm talking about, perhaps a 3 feet tall roll of craft paper. So those little documents that you see here are letter sized. So you can see how they're pasted, or it's sort of a kindergartner's work where we want to show everything, but that's done on purpose too. Right? So these are work documents. They are the repositories of a description of how we do things, the description of live documents after interviews when you're following each step of the process. Right? So imagine what this looks like for, let's say, a forecast to stock. We start with the idea of selling. So the first step in this workflow process map is, how do we know how much we're going to sell? And that doesn't take you to the planner typically. Maybe it doesn't even take you to the sales manager. Maybe it takes you to your finance manager or the owner himself or herself. And she'll say, well, I want to take last year and apply 15% on top. This is very common. So that 15%, surprisingly so, drives the work for 50 people down the line throughout the year to try to accommodate the 15% that's kind of painted broadly throughout the year. So if you start at that moment when the owner of the company says 15% growth, apply it throughout, for example, and how that turns into a document that the finance manager reviews and approves, and then we do have a sales manager that says 15%, okay, I need to take it account by account. And that person perhaps uses an Excel file and then kind of multiplies by 15, but then, matches categories, because now some will grow 50% and some will decrease in sales. That's what you want to track. Not, so similar to tracking a product, but now you're following this piece of data as it finds its way from the once a year forecast down to the perhaps once a month, specific budget or sales objective, and then into production, right? So we're going to sell 15%. If somebody went and said, we're just going to buy 15% more cardboard and lids and buckets and milk and meat or whatever it is that you do, you're going to go broke, right? So people, as they do their job, they distill that and have to add something to the sauce, right? That's what you're trying to track, right? So this means that this means that there are surprises at every corner. I'll give you a quick example, and I'll show you a couple more on the next slide. Let's say we go to a company that says, hey, we've got fill rate issues. Really? Okay, well, let's understand why. And we realize that this company has a byproduct. And this is the byproduct that has a fill rate issue. So they make a product A. The byproduct of product A is turned into product B. So if you don't sell product A, you're not making any more product B, right? That's easy to do. However, sales reps don't know. So now it's not a fill rate problem. It's a problem about revenue management. So if you can't make any more of B, sell it to the customers that give you the most margin, for example, right? And those are the kinds of surprises that are only visible if you look at the end-to-end process. So process mapping is very important. Here you'll see a few examples of how these process maps are used, and I really wanted to show you this because now you can appreciate the size and scale of and how we work. Right? So you'll see some on the wall, you'll see some on desks, and on purpose there are no chairs here. And the chairs are there, but we don't use them. We're walking around the inside of those tables, reading these documents as we review them together. Right? So somebody will or a group of people will put these together, and then the larger organization decision makers get together every week in that 3-week period that we talked about. We walk around. So reading through, you realize, imagine this person that has to use a version of the 15% that she gets down the line, perhaps in March, right? And now it's no longer 15%, it's 30%, right? Because somebody else in budgeting says, these guys are never going to hit it. So let's just cushion it. So now we're buying 30% extra of certain items when, it really started as 15% or the other way around. If you see it all together, and these folks that have something to do in the process realize that these opportunities are there, that is where you discover, but we have these eureka moments, and then get into something that really makes a difference for the organization. The second tool that we use are observational studies. And, we call these day in the life of somebody. When you read through them, this is a snapshot of what this looks like. It has a few parts. We also bring copies of the document, and we kind of paste it all together, and it's something that you can read like you would a novel, right? It's something that's completed by consultants, and you can certainly do this as well, obviously, spending full days with key personnel. So imagine that you're sitting down with this scheduler, or you are spending beside a supervisor for a full shift, right? Before the shift starts, during the shift, and then after the shift. And you document every 2 minutes what the type of work this person is performing and for how long. So what you'll see here hopefully you can see my mouse is a little set of, every line here is 2 minutes. You'll see the colors here represent the type of activity, and we'll talk about classification. There's an activity descriptor and then comments. And what we want to learn here are the realities of the work process in motion. So one thing is for somebody to say, well, we send the job to the floor, and then the inventory is right there for the ingredients and the packaging materials. Somebody just goes out there and captures it, and then bring them in. They process it, and out the other end comes finished goods. And this costs normally 20 cents per pound. Excellent. Okay. And then you spend a day with the supervisor. You realize that things are not near as easy, or they don't flow as easy as it's been described before, right? So think about trying to address a productivity issue, right? So somebody says perhaps those 20 cents should be 15 because that's in the budget at this volume, and you say, well, perhaps it's it's a productivity or leadership issue. You can find that there's perhaps breakdown issues, but maybe the line, when it runs perfect. But there are so many changeovers caused by perhaps an inventory mismanagement, and it's not under the control of the line. And it is through these observations that you'll learn all the details of the reality of the execution of the systems. So we typically perform 1 or 2 observation studies per day. So during a 3-week period of time, just for your reference, we've got 10 to 20 observation studies of all the different functions. You'll see here supervisors, warehouse managers. And what we want to do is color code the activities from adding value to not adding value. It's a way to see on a common color code which areas are performing more admin work, or work supervisors that are operating machines instead of actually supervising, and those kinds of things. One thing that's interesting about this is what you're also looking for in these activities are things that are not there. You're looking for best practices, like, for example, supervisors that come in, they start a shift, and they don't assign activity. Supervisors that come in and they don't check for materials to be delivered. Supervisors that come in, start a shift, and they don't talk to the previous supervisor to understand what the machines are doing and perhaps plan ahead. So best practices that should be there, but also other elements that I'm sure you're aware of. And this is the moment to imagine what the area would look like, production line, for example, if you had them. Very practically speaking, if we had a whiteboard, I'm not talking about technology, although that helps, a whiteboard that tracks production every hour. If we had that, can we give operators and the supervisor a cue of performance? Yeah, well, let's start imagining what that would look like. And has it ever been in place, and perhaps it's no longer being maintained? So these day-to-day activities are very valuable in contrasting what's on the workflows with the reality of the day-to-day of operators and your staff. And the last thing that you want to do, and this is critical, is to develop metrics. And so this is something that we really work on during those 3 weeks, and you should too. It typically involves some data wrangling. So if you have a strong IT department, this helps a lot. Otherwise, get the right tools, or find somebody in your organization that loves Excel, and get some downloads and mass data and work on it. Because what you want to do is demonstrate that what you're seeing in each one of those days that you spend with the supervisor, where perhaps the machine was down for 3 hours, you want to demonstrate yourself that those 3 hours are in fact a normal, right? Something that happens every day. So, for example, you could download from the machine the download codes and kind of go through time and see if it's 3 hours on average or 2 or 6. Perhaps what you want to do is look at inventory value over time and then find those peaks and valleys and tie them to processes that you're observing. Perhaps what you want to do is track changeovers. I was giving you an example of this is something actually surprisingly common of mismanaged inventory that turns into emergency changeovers that blow product down the drain or take a long time to do. And this is just production, but there are a good number of statistics. And if you guys want some tips, feel free to reach out after the session if you want, of the different ways you can measure best practices. And the top corner there, you'll see cross-selling. So essentially product penetration and different ways to group products in charts and different views that will speak to you. So these numbers are the three elements, right? So I'll go back and say a good, strong, detailed workflow where you trace a piece of data or pieces of data throughout the organization. Forecast to stock, perhaps, and customer order, and then how it's supplied, all the way through inventory, production, whatever it goes through. Right? Number two, direct observation of what these your team members are doing on a day-to-day basis to support those activities. So you'll interview a few of them as you do the workflow. But perhaps you want to look at activities of folks that you're not interviewing. And number three, the related metrics to the scope. So if you're doing forecast to stock, you'd need to do sales, biggest products, and then biggest customers, their order schedule, and perhaps there's a seasonality there. If you're doing production, obviously productivity and some of the other elements that perhaps you're already measuring, focused on the assessment. And those three things, point in the direction of improvement. But as we said, you don't want to start an assessment with the idea of the solution. You want to start the assessment with just the scope that's in line with the strategy. However, you do get to that point where now you have results. How do you work them? What do you do? What do you do now? Well, what you want to do now is, one, build a roadmap. Two, once you have the pieces of the puzzle of the roadmap, prioritize those activities in a way that perhaps one will fuel the other one, and then think about the resources that are going to be supporting the assessment, the project, the solution, what methodology you need to bring in, and think about audit. And so I'll talk about these few elements in detail now, and I'll start with this. This is an example of what comes out of an assessment. Most customers we work with, processors will see this, and it sounds and looks simplistic, but it isn't. If you've been present for the last 3 weeks of during the assessment, and we work with the staff that runs these products, those processes, and they realize that the 15% turns into 30, I'm referring to that example earlier, and how that turns into inventory, and how inventory turns into imbalances, and that turns into perhaps changeovers, et cetera, et cetera. These numbers make sense. And so what you'll probably discover early on, sorry about that, what you'll probably discover early on is that this is easy to describe. And so this is what you find. It's the result of, I'm pointing to the current state column, right? Is the result of your findings. You'll find that you can describe opportunities in processes, and if you do the numbers on these opportunities, they come in here too. So I'll read a couple of these, and you can imagine how this came about. There are regular customers with margins below operating expenses of 15%. Perhaps your financial director said, yeah, this is happening. Perhaps you do the numbers and you realize that once you drill in, customers are making you lose money. You've got an average of 8 orders processed per day per sales representative. And, if you look at the dispersion of these average orders processed per day, you do perhaps have sales reps that process 12 orders instead of 8. So it points at the imbalance of orders per sales representative. I'll talk about warehouse, right? So for instance, average of 41 pieces per hour on the incoming and the outgoing, and maybe the dispersion is in fact up to 80. Maybe the top performer is 80. So you've got a few people that are throwing down your average significantly. And so all of these are operational factors that you can work with. Okay. Now, the key here is to use the assessment to make solution relevant for the business. So there's a jump here, and it takes some practice, but I'm sure you guys know your business well enough to be able to do this, to convert current state into possibility and to put value next to that possibility. And this is what we do in this one slide. This is what you should strive to do at the end of your assessment. It's not just describing the operational factors that can be worked with, but it is to quantify those opportunities and describe what you're going to do, right? So, for example, on the second column right here, you said savings source. You know, what we want to do, I'm going to use the example of a warehouse because it's easy to understand, reduce employees overtime from incoming operation by increasing receiving productivity, right? So we are targeting specific financial accounts over time and tying the change with something that is feasible, that we've inspected the process for, that we've been with supervisors that work with warehouse operators, and we've seen the opportunities that we can address. And, you know, there's a separate list that goes, you know, there's a lot too much detail here, but you can imagine it, right? We are not just talking about getting a whip for the supervisor and making sure that people work at twice the pieces per hour. It's not that. It turns out that when we went out in this specific example, we went out with that supervisor for a full shift, and we realized that there were errors in the configuration of the ERP. The inventory was not very reliable because they were not completing some transactions. So on receiving and on picking, they could not find the pieces. You know, they wanted to go fast, but they couldn't. So it pointed at housekeeping in the warehouse as one of the factors, right? And there were others. But, you know, we can very clearly describe what we're going to be working with during a project. We're proposing to work on these elements. None of them are simple on their own, but we can work on them together, and they'll make a big difference in increasing the average pieces per hour for this one process. And the same thing goes for everything else. You know, for production or for sales, we're talking about tying operational elements to savings. And something to think about as you plan for action. What you want to do is prioritize these ideas based on a few things. Perhaps you want to consider culture and you know, whether you want to focus on compliance. Some organizations are like this. They focus on, you know, raw ingredients that are organic and not a single trace of any contaminants, right? Or they're vegan, for example, that kind of thing. Efficiency. So companies that are, you know, we find these factors like efficiency in larger organizations that have the time to focus on these things, or perhaps that they've been acquired by private equity groups, right? So a lot of efficiency. Let's squeeze efficiency as much as we can, and then maybe sales. So what's more important to the organization at this moment? Even though we have, I'm going to go jump back for a second, even though we have all these opportunities, and certainly some of them are bigger in dollars than the others, you know, this is something that we can't do everything at the same time. So the culture has a lot to do. Also, what you want to do is string projects together logically. So perhaps you say, well, we can't sell more if we don't have a strong manufacturing facility, and we know that we have our opportunities. You know, they're being quantified and described properly. So maybe we will work on production first, and then we can go out and look for new customers. Sometimes customers say, well, let's focus on money. Let's just go for savings. And once we have money flowing from those savings, we can fuel that into other investments, other new projects, or perhaps just refining existing processes. We want to improve on what we have, not completely change it. So that's one way to look at priorities. But also, there are key improvement principles. And so, perhaps you want to think about just driving the reduction of complexity, for example, uniting disparate processes or simplifying existing processes. We do a lot of work for processors that have asset plants that were built, perhaps started 10 years ago, and then they acquired new production lines or new businesses. And now there's a second and a third and a fourth asset plan. And they're all different. The control forms are completely different, and they're difficult to maintain, etc. So reducing complexity is a big driver of improvement. Sources of waste for you guys that are lean trained, this is obvious. Not measuring outcome is something that you should target right away. If you don't measure it, it's going to be out of control, certainly. And then top-down involvement and drive accountability as a way to say, this project, what it's going to do is it's going to change the way supervisors look at their role. So instead of being a glorified operator, we want supervisors to actually manage the company. So that's number one. We're going to change the culture. And so alongside the other factors of prioritization, this is how we build a roadmap, right? So, at the very end of the assessment, as you're working towards getting people on, you describe what we're changing, you set up baselines, this is where we're coming from, pieces per hour or whatever it is, goals and savings methodology, and a detailed work schedule that looks perhaps something like this. And so you want to string projects together from perhaps the current state. And what are we going to do first? Let's say, for instance, efficient customer order processing. We want to target the low-hanging fruit to increase on-time deliveries. Then we're going to focus on inventory control. So if we increase inventory accuracy, then we can implement best practices that will give us a lot of money. And now we can use that money, for example, to implement a new ERP, which we need sorely, and so on and so forth. It's a very high level, but very purposeful set of projects that string one to each other to increase efficiencies, to increase company value, to a future state where you're solving some of these opportunities. You're not making this up because you worked hard at the assessment. You have a lot of foundation information and specific goals in mind. So this is more or less the high level of the assessment. I have a couple more slides on methodology that I want to share with you, just to make sure that you, as you propose solutions, you have something to go by. The first one is very obvious. We learned this in school and in practice, and how hard change is. We bring a few solutions to the table when we do projects, and you should perhaps consider these three different perspectives. They help us a lot to understand what the challenges are and the implementation of these changes and how to address them separately. So what we think about on the implementation of projects typically is this: the deployment of the solution. So the analysis, the training, the implementation, the documentation, so that the solution can be deployed. And what we like to say is, don't think only about the engineering behind the solution, if you will, but think about the resistance to change of the organization, the cultural inertia of the leadership and the rest of the staff, and the project management that you need to do alongside communication. So, for example, something that we like to do, and it's a no-brainer perhaps, but sometimes we're too busy to think about these things. Give the project a name. Give it a mascot. Have the name come from operators themselves. Newsletters are very important in a way to be very consistent about them. Most companies are not very consistent about them. But in other words, think about creating the conditions for project success. What needs to happen in the organization? We like to describe it as the Disney moment that you need to create for your staff. And they're exactly that. We want people to realize that they are part of this and that others are helping them have a better day to day. So those operators that have to struggle to find the ingredients in a warehouse, we want them to have a better day. And that's why we're doing this, for instance. It's a completely different way to portray it, and it's a change management element. Compared to, for example, this is the new way of doing things. Let me train you, and from now on, we'll measure if you perform or not. Right? It's completely different. And human capital development, depending on the scope of the project, is something we want to do. Process owners, here, what we want to do is make sure that everyone is involved. So typically, we have weekly meetings where it isn't the folks that are involved in the day-to-day of the project, but the ultimate decision makers, sales, production, quality, that are owning the project. So, again, if you have questions about how we do this, so you can implement something like this, feel free to reach out. But this is how we drive accountability in the organization, so that it isn't what we commonly find, just perhaps a QA department working on let's say the certification process, and it's just QA's project. Quite the contrary, we want to make sure that the organization at large is responsible for anything that comes out of the assessment. And you can imagine that if you have a process flow and everyone collaborates to build it, they'll be more aware of why we're doing things and how we want to improve. And finally, plan for the audit. So what we want to do is not only say we're going to, let's say, change the layout of the warehouse because it's going to make a difference in processes down the line and it'll be easier and more productive. Okay. Well, if we change today, how do we make sure that it stays in place? We don't want it to be a single one-shot change. We want it to be permanent. So what we encourage you to do today is prepare documentation to become the standard. So you can call it an SOP. Perhaps we can stop at the SOP. We like to go further and develop the auditing document checklist or description of functions that you can use every 3 months initially, every 6 months later, and then every year afterwards on very strict, again, the specific 2-day audits, and be strict about reporting. So what you want to do, if you think about this, is to kind of, take it back to the beginning, right? If you want to improve the performance of your company, these are the steps. Do an assessment with some of the aspects that we are suggesting you do. Run a project with these 3 elements: solution deployment, change management, and human capital development. And then finally, prepare for an audit so that change is permanent. Most companies, we like to tell our customers, just scratch the wall and there's money coming out. So if you pay attention to your surroundings and if you follow methodology like this, I'm sure you can find a lot of pleasant surprises in your company, and we hope that this information today will help you do that at your facility. Let's see, and that's who we are. That's what we do. I hope that this information has been valuable for you.
All right. Well, thank you, Daniel. I'm going to make sure I have controls here. I was actually taking a whole bunch of notes too. So there's tons of good stuff in there. Wasn't sure where to interject some of these. So I know we've got a couple minutes left. If you're okay, I'll fire off a couple questions at you. And just as a side commentary, I think, I hope some of our customers that were on were hearing this too, because a lot of what you're doing is exposing data, right? And you talked about some of the OEE and downtime, and it's amazing when you start capturing that and giving it some visual value. So that's something that we do see a lot, and it's fun to help them on that side. And the standardization, you gave that example of how complex things can be from an old asset plan and an old plant and new company and new divisions. These are all places that I think you add value to our customers. So really good stuff. One kind of general question that came up is, do you have any suggestions? Do you have any suggestions about how to do this across multiple facilities? And I think that's a good question, because most of our customers do have, even if they're a smaller organization, they oftentimes will have multiple facilities. Do you have any kind of general advice on that?
Absolutely. I would, generally speaking, I would say that each facility deserves its own assessment, unless you have like interrelated processes. For example, one the producer, the other one is the distribution or multiple distribution centers. Perhaps you can share some of the lessons. The reality is this probably applies to companies that are, located in different states, and that already, means that it's a completely different company culture. So I would say plan for separate assessments, and you'll be more efficient as you go from the first to the second. It's more than likely the same products or some of the same leaders, but given enough time, there's a lot to learn at each assessment.
No, it's a fair point. We hear it jokingly referred to as we all do the same thing differently, right? So I think that's a good approach. And then the famous brown paper can be at least the baseline. So, and you really do use those, right? The brown paper, that's like actual examples of what you use. You can simplify it that much, right?
Absolutely. Yes. And you actually want to do that. If you can't get the original document, get a copy. We've seen people develop brown papers where, for example, they seal documentation or they seal trucks, and we want to see those seals. We want to see if they're easy to tamper with, for example, right? So just bring it along, paste it on the paper, roll it up. It's bulky, or maybe there's a bump on it, but it'll add to the accuracy and information you can gather from it.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Where do you see typically the most savings come from? Because that's at the end of the day what drives a lot of this. So in a food facility, where do you typically see either the biggest challenges and needs, or the greatest savings?
I would say savings come from two main areas. One is the usage of capacity. So that means selling more or spreading out fixed costs differently. So, selling more is typically the angle we take, or our clients, processors take. And the other thing to do is old school, quote unquote, old school productivity. You mentioned OEE, even though it's a well-known metric, and it's everyone knows what it is, right? It's very hard to put in place effectively. But once you do, there's a lot you can do with, let's say, an automated OEE system that pokes your eye every time there's a significant downtime or something like that. It's the real-time element of it that makes a difference. So productivity in lines and warehouses and some other perhaps back office is, if you have 10 people in your back office, that's a huge opportunity. And then increased sales. There's a lot of, typically, especially if it's B2B, but it's fairly diverse. If you've got customers, you're more than likely leaving money on the table, and you should go and take a look. There's a lot of money there, typically.
The old scratch the wall and there's money. I like that one. And by the way, my kids say anything like pre-iPhone is old school. So I think that's how we define it at our house. I don't know. I'm all for old school though. That stuff works, right? So that's great.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So I do want to make sure that we point out to everybody that as I mentioned, Daniel, he's been kind enough to allow us to share the deck. We'll be getting that out. and he is a great resource. So we'll include in our follow-up email direct contact information for him. You can find him on LinkedIn and connect with him there, as well as the London Consulting Group. They do some really great work, and obviously we just scratched the surface here. I think everyone can see, again, as you opened up, Daniel, regardless of your size or the vertical you're in within food and beverage, this stuff applies and can really make a big difference. And I appreciate you walking us through it. The goal is to take away. There's the do-it-yourself kit, and obviously there's some really great resources like Daniel and his team to help you out there. So we, speaking of resources, also have more of these as well. So we'll be putting up this recording. We'll also be turning this into a piece of content that you can download here in the coming weeks and months. We also have more information about Daniel and his team you can connect with, and as well as about our technology. So again, a lot of what he was talking about, we're able to really help integrate into your processes through technology, and that's when it gets really fun. So we'd love a chance to chat with you. Again, you can learn more or check out our resource page at Safety Chain. Tons of great stuff, tons of great content from all of these experts that we're so lucky to partner with. So I want to thank everybody for making time in your busy schedules for being here. And Daniel, thanks for putting all this together. This was great, and we look forward to having you back and dig in a little deeper.
Thanks, Brian. Pleasure to be here.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful day, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next month on the Beyond Compliance series. Have a good one.